you said, we're looking at each other when we laugh. There are mirror neurons that are taking place there.
That's why the laughter yoga probably is so effective. Because at first it's like you're kind of emulating or you're kind of pretending like you're laughing really hard. But when you start to actually do it and you're looking around at people laughing. Right. Like I started laughing thinking about people laughing. Like, yeah. So I think that's, Anyway, you were saying.
Oh, that's it. We can pick back up.
Yeah, let's pick up. We're on. We're recording.
All right. Well,
so everybody be serious now, please. Act natural.
Right. No, be funny.
Yeah, exactly.
Where'd he go?
Now, be funny. Well, welcome back, everybody. This is the official podcast of Nystrom and Associates. Blah, blah, blah. Yada. No, we're just really excited to jump back in. Go back and listen to our previous episode. We're here with Dr. Melissa Mork, and she is a certified humor professional. She's a professor of clinical and forensic psychology at Northwestern, international speaker, founder and CEO of
Mental Health
Matters. And
all around great person.
When you list all that, no wonder I'm tired.
I know, right? I was like, do you sleep?
No.
Yeah, this isn't funny.
Just while I drive. Otherwise, I
also noticed in your email signature, it said avid shoe wearer.
I am.
Right. And I admire that. I think that's beautiful.
I wear shoes all the time. Except inside, but
I'm trying to quit.
Yeah.
But you were mentioning
now that is self-ascribed, right?
Yeah.
That one is
right.
Certified shoe wearer.
Yes.
So we were talking off air.
Off
I just
air.
wanted to say that
off the record.
We were talking a little bit about how serious humor is because we were just talking in the previous episode.
Yeah.
The impact, the positive impact, the necessary impact it has on us to cope, to deal with life, in relationships. Yeah. And yet I had a little bit of self-disclosure that I like to horse around a lot. I like to have fun. And I always have this sense, this part of my mind that says, I need to be more mature. I mean, I'm in my 50s and I got to serious up more.
Yeah.
And we were talking like...
No, that's not true at all.
I don't think that you should.
No, I don't know that you could. Well, because in your role, humor in a leader is so effective, so powerful because it levels the playing field. It brings you down to the level of everybody else. They feel there's affiliation with you when you make them laugh. In the classroom, if I can get my students to laugh, suddenly they realize, okay, she's not taking this all so seriously. We don't have to take it so seriously. Yes. I can joke about the test. I can show them my own errors. I can talk about the time when my counselor told me that I should go into meat cutting instead of psychology. And my students laugh and they think, okay, I don't have to take this so seriously. And their test anxiety goes down. Their angst around getting A's goes down. Their ability to make their own mistakes is acknowledged and accepted. And so as a leader in business, in mental health, same. You're providing safety for everyone around you when you're allowing them to laugh, when you're laughing at yourself.
Exactly.
All things that we hear in therapy are core issues that people are struggling to get over.
Yeah.
Am I good enough? Performance anxiety, aloneness, and things that all you're really highlighting. Humor helps with these very serious and pervasive issues we all struggle with.
Yes.
In all contexts.
Yes. Can I use an example to that point?
Yes.
So my son, and again, he gave me permission to talk about this. I asked him one time, can I tell your story? And he said, yeah, if you tell my story, other people will feel less alone, which I love that attitude of generosity. So when he was in the midst of an active psychosis episode, he's diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, depressive type. He had this delusion that there was a very malignant, demonic character, like an actual demon attached to his back. And no matter how he would look in the mirror, he couldn't see it because it would always duck behind. So it was not visible to him, but he knew it was there and it was ominous. So he told his friends, and he's got this great group of friends, and they were very open and willing to walk alongside him in this and even step into his reality. And he said, I've got this demon on my back. And they kind of looked behind him and they're like, oh, wow, that must be really scary. And he said, I can't see it, but it's always lingering behind me. And then one of them said, that reminds me of Zach. They have a friend who's always like 10 steps behind them. They go to the state fair. Zach's always like back there. Everywhere they go, Zach's hanging behind. And they said, you should name that guy Zachary. So he did. He named it Zachary. They all named it Zachary. And so when Sam would show up, he'd show up to play, D&D or something, they would be like, hey, Sam, hey, Zachary. And then, they'd be playing video games and somebody would like win something and they'd be like, yeah, high five, Zachary. And they would like reach behind Sam and high five Zachary. And then they would, he would walk in and they'd be like, hey, Sam, looking good. Zachary, nice hat. And they just did not take it all that seriously. They would joke and tease and nudge. And one day I was asking Sam, what's going on with Zachary? He goes, oh, he's gone. He went away. The laughter, the joking, the gentle teasing signaled to Sam that it wasn't malignant. It was benign. It wasn't anything that they were afraid of. They could step into his reality that existed, but they weren't going to step into the reality that it was harmful.
Wow.
And I think it's a powerful example of how humor and laughter can take something terribly serious and terribly frightening. And when everyone is open to it, it can become less so.
Yes.
So powerful. Again, it speaks to really what we need.
Yes.
And I think I've mentioned this before. I think we know that children laugh considerably more than adults. And I think as we become adults, we equate maturity
with seriousness. Yeah.
And so if you're laughing a lot, you're not as serious. And we have to be professional in certain environments. And we are really hamstringing ourselves in terms of effectiveness and performance and things by not being funny enough. So,
right. I mean, if we look at the fact that we use humor, when humor is used in conflict negotiation, it builds trust and commonality. When we see humor being used in hostage negotiation, it brings a connection between the hostage negotiator and the perpetrator. It builds trust, right? So, of course, it's going to do that in leadership, in business, in parenting, in teaching, and all of these. And as a therapist, you being self-deprecating, you seeing humor in areas that connect you to the client, it builds mutual trust.
Yes, it does. Well, and so in the last episode, you had mentioned, you had talked about what it took to become a certified humor professional, and it was a 3-year program, and that at the end you had to do a project or kind of finish with something, and yours was on grief and humor.
Yeah, and I actually wrote a book. It started out it's called Navigating Grief with Humor, but then McGraw-Hill picked it up and changed the name of it and the cover. So it's called Bounce.
Oh, wow.
From Surviving to Thriving Through Loss.
Amazing. By
Melissa Mork. It's on Amazon and McGraw-Hill. But it is, it's all about stages of grief, tasks of grief, work of grief, but also how humor helps.
Wow.
My mother when I was in college, my mother was a funny lady. Like she would come up to visit me and take me grocery shopping. And I'd get to the checkout and she would be thumbing through a magazine and I'd be putting things on the conveyor belt, and I'd put the boxes of cereal and underneath would be an enema kit, or there would be tucked underneath bladder pads or king size box of condoms. And I would have to just, hand it over to the clerk and say, I'm sorry, I changed my mind on these bladder pads. And my mother would continue to just like thumb through the magazine, pretending that she wasn't.
Right. That's good stuff.
Yeah. And then she also was a terrible cook. There were 8 kids in the family and she could not be bothered to cook anything edible for us. But one time she made spaghetti and she knew my father liked meat in his spaghetti sauce. But after she'd already started boiling the spaghetti, realized there was no ground beef, nothing in the refrigerator except hot dogs. So she took the hot dogs out and she didn't cut them up. She threw them in the blender to make She thought maybe she'd make
Puree?
brown. Yeah. Well, it quickly became puree. And then she poured that sludge into the spaghetti sauce and served it to us. And it was inedible. It was so bad, even she couldn't eat it.
Yes.
But my parents were both born during the Depression, and so they couldn't waste food. So she put this stuff, the noodles and sludge, in a freezer dish, and then with masking tape wrote wiener spaghetti, and put it in the freezer. And then after she would pull it out every so often and put it on the counter to thaw, just as my father was getting home from work, and he would see it and say, "You want to go out to eat?" And she'd say, "Well, sure." And she would put that stuff back in the freezer, pull out frozen pizzas for us kids, and off they would go.
Nice.
And it became an ongoing joke. And so when I was in college, she was killed in a car crash. And my sister and I were cleaning out the freezer, and we found this block of ice that you could barely see, wiener spaghetti, written on the masking tape deep below. But when she passed away, we all converged back at the house, and it was just a very sad time. I mean, it was devastatingly sad. And we planned the funeral, and the day of the funeral, we were sitting up front. We were filling up the first 2 rows. And it was a serious Presbyterian affair. And the pastor, halfway through the sermon or the service, he stopped and he said, "I want everyone to just take a moment, turn to a neighbor, and share a favorite story about Trudy." And my family and I, we couldn't participate, but we listened. And at first there were just, sniffles and whispers. And there were giggles and chuckles. And pretty soon there were snorts and guffaws. And it felt like the walls of the church were shaking with laughter.
Yes.
And it was in that moment it occurred to me that I was allowed to laugh. If I could remember my mom with laughter, I could get through this. What humor and laughter does in grief is it pulls us closer to the person. William Worden, who is a professor at Harvard University, he recognized that there are 4 tasks of grief. We think there are stages of grief, and those were written by Kubler-Ross for the medical community to understand the processes that the terminally ill go through as they move towards the acceptance of their impending death. It wasn't meant for us to understand grief or bereavement after the death of a loved one.
Sure.
They may resonate slightly, but that isn't really what helps us through our grief process. William Worden said there are tasks that we have to accomplish, and one of them is to create an enduring relationship with the deceased. We don't want to say goodbye. We want to continue to love them and find a way to relocate them in our heart. The power of humor is that if I can remember my mom with laughter, when I can remember the funny moments I told you about at the grocery store or the wiener spaghetti, I feel closer to her. Suddenly she's present and alive in my heart. Humor has a powerful role in actually accomplishing some of the tasks of grief.
Wow. That is so helpful.
It makes so much sense when you explain it with the examples too, because I think it's one thing to tell someone about, how humor can help with grief, but it's not until you share exactly how you just did.
Right.
How it keeps the person alive in your heart. It's
right.
Wow.
Right.
That is powerful.
And even when I'm doing grief coaching, I will talk with the bereaved and we will go through the really hard parts of the relationship where, when I think about the times that I argued with my husband, the way, how we would, I would push his buttons and he would get angry. And when I focus on that, I feel farther apart from him. It deepens my grief. It makes it more complicated.
Yeah.
And it's necessary to process those moments and those experiences. But at the end of a session, I want to talk about how he made me laugh, how I brought a smile to his face, how he would tease me. And when I talk about that, I'm put back together and my relationship is cemented again with him. And I can walk out of that room feeling secure that it was indeed a good relationship, in the end. So it absolutely does help in that process.
And some of the most difficult grief that I come across with clients is this ambiguous grief, this complicated grief where
man.
you have an adult child that's really has serious addiction issues, and you don't know if they're alive or dead, or a child's been abducted, or you don't know really.
Or even a difficult childhood where you lost a childhood and you don't really know how to put a finger on it because of addiction in the parents or dysfunction. I mean, there's so many forms of ambiguous grief
and forms of just less intense grief. I lost my job. I lost this.
Foreclosure on the house. Yeah.
So it's so helpful to incorporate humor in these areas. And so many other areas. So, boy, we could keep going forever and ever here. One question I think people have then is, how do I do this? Yeah. How do I incorporate grief? And so how do you do it effectively? And how do you avoid doing it ineffectively? We all know, like, sometimes people do try to be funny, and you're like, dude, that's just not appropriate right now. So and we've been the recipient of that, and it can feel very invalidating to how we're feeling. So how do we effectively incorporate humor, and then how do we avoid this ineffective kind?
So there are 4 humor styles I want to tell you about. So think of a kind of a quadrant, and on the vertical is risky humor versus healthy humor. And on the horizontal quadrant, you have other-oriented and self-oriented. So an example of risky, other-oriented humor is considered aggressive or hostile. It's ageist, racist, sexist, any of the isms, right? But also it could be teasing, ridicule, sarcasm. And some of those we use often, and they're actually pretty effective. If I can, gently tease my kid about something that isn't an insecurity, but we both agree that it's, something that's kind of quirky, it's effective, right? But there's risk. If I'm going to use sarcasm with somebody, for example, my stepdaughter, I'll be sarcastic and she'll say, I don't understand sarcasm. And no sarcasm with you. So it can be kind of risky. The other risky humor would be self-deprecation. Like if I can make fun of myself in front of my students, in front of my kids, in front of my employees, right? But it can go too far if it starts to I lose face with them, or if I take it too far and suddenly they can't trust me that I'm competent.
Or they're like, don't say that about yourself.
Too far. Yeah, gone too far. If they love me, they don't want to hear it. But also self-deprecation can be really helpful in level the playing field. And if I joke about my own foibles, then my students are like, okay, well, I guess we're allowed to fail, right? So that can be risky, but also pretty beneficial. Then on the other side, we've got other-oriented humor that's healthy, and it's called affiliative. And a lot of what we've been doing here today has been affiliative humor, where we're talking, we're laughing, we're cheering each other up. And you'll hear this a lot in social situations. You'll hear laughter, and then you walk up and say, what were you guys laughing about? And they were like, I don't remember. It's just the giggling. It's the laughing. It's the kind of the social lubricant that keeps the conversations going. And it's healthy. It creates bonds. It creates those mirror neurons. And laughter yoga that we've described is affiliative. But self-enhancing humor is both, it's self-oriented and it's healthy. And that is finding the funny, looking for humor, going on TikTok to watch funny videos, going to stand up, just finding the funny, watching your kitten frolic it's self-enhancing. It makes you laugh. It's really good. And you can do that all by yourself. Back to your question of what is effective versus ineffective humor. If somebody is going through something, you need to let them take the lead. You need to be gentle. But really, it needs to be their sense of humor that is enhanced. It needs to be their humor style that is encouraged. You can be gently humorous as you are, right? You're obviously, clearly very easy to be around and very easily humored, and you easily share your humor. So I'm guessing that you're probably pretty sensitive in knowing when and where and what is the time to do that. If it is tone deaf, there have been times when, you say something and you realize, whoa, that was absolutely inappropriate, you can say, sorry, I'm calling that was inappropriate. And then just turning the table, right? Okay. Just going a different direction. But effective humor usually is going to be self-enhancing, self-directed, self-affirming, or affirming from the other person. So if you're going to be with a patient, you want it to be the humor to be affirming of them, affirming of their situation, finding the funny, the ironic, that they're talking about to highlight, well, isn't that ironic? Isn't that, that kind of thing. So it's a delicate dance. It can be very effective.
Yeah, because a lot of times we do it, we don't even know what my motivation is. I like the idea of letting kind of the other person be the guide if they're going through something. But sometimes we don't even realize, I can't handle your pain right now.
Yes.
And so I'm going to make a joke. And I think I'm helping you, but I'm really trying to help myself.
Exactly. Boy, is that insightful. Yes, exactly.
It's hard to know that too, sometimes for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just a word of caution.
Yeah, it is a word of caution. Totally. And also there's another caution is you need to make sure that when you are, for example, teasing, that you're not targeting an insecurity and that you're not targeting, like if you're teasing your kid about something, to make sure it isn't something they can't reciprocate. They don't have the vocabulary or the ability to tease back.
Right.
When I'm, joking in the classroom and I'm teasing my students, I had better well be teasing myself first so that they know that there's safety there. And they need to be able to collude and tease me and me not take offense, right? I need to make that clear that that's a safe place, that I can take that humor. But you need to test it gently. So when you're beginning a relationship with somebody or you're talking to somebody about their pain, you need to, in the very beginning stages of the conversation, see where they are, if they're at a place where they can receive the humor, that they can find the humor. If they can't, then don't go there.
Right.
It can be really destructive if we're not careful.
It can be risky.
One of the reasons I love, you had mentioned the podcast, The Hilarious World of Depression. One of the reasons I loved that is because it took on the topic of, depression, mental health, and how humor can be incorporated. So I was just thinking about how, if we have listeners who are struggling with a mental health issue right now, or who are, I just found myself thinking, I hope people realize that we're not saying that all you have to do is just laugh more to get past your mental health issues and I clearly, there's been entire books written by Dr. Mork, of course, on this topic, but I think I just wanted to kind of point that out, that it goes beyond just finding more levity in life. It's this is actually a biological, neurological process that is happening. That should be kind of added to your arsenal.
It's a tool in your toolkit.
It's a tool in your toolkit. And you had talked about your son and his journey with mental health. Right. And so humor was just it was an added tool in addition to getting all this other help.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. That's a great point. It's not a cure-all. It's a coping mechanism.
Yes.
And it can often be effective and not always.
Sure.
But I really appreciate your clarification on that.
Well, and I think it's underutilized. That's the other piece that I think we're able to highlight, is that it's a tool in the toolkit, but look at all the different, even just the quadrants you were just talking about. Yeah. I was like, oh my gosh, that's such a good, concise way to describe the different types of humor.
Yeah.
Right. And I was just thinking through examples in my own life of when I've used different kinds and when I've heard other people use different kinds. So it's it really is an art. Right?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's something, go ahead.
You refine that art, you refine your skills in that area, the more you use it.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I so appreciate what you said about teasing too.
Yeah.
Because for many men, that's how we connect. We tease.
Oh, yeah.
And it's hard to know that boundary. My wife works predominantly male environment, and it's all men. And she was a little confused because she would leave at 5 and her supervisor would say, oh, it must be nice to leave at 5. And she was really stressed. And she's like, wow, and she's defending herself. And I said, no, you don't understand. With guys, when he says, it must be nice to leave at 5, you say, well, if you get your lazy butt in here early, you could leave at 5 too.
Right.
And you give it back.
Right.
And she's, Oh, like trying to.
Right.
So she worked on it, like you said.
It's part of that culture.
Yes.
So one of the areas that I studied was dark humor in first responders, law enforcement officers, nurses.
Yes, thank you.
And so I use an example of my brother-in-law who's in law enforcement. Very early on in his career, they had to drag for a body in a river. And it was a young man that they were looking for. And they finally found him and they pulled him ashore. And they had been up all night doing this.
Yes.
And so my brother-in-law, Dick, he's exhausted and he flops down on the grass, face up. He's laying there. And then they drag the body up and lay it down right next to him. And he just laid there and he said, when the coroner comes, make sure they get the right body. Right?
I love it.
I do too. Well, and so I was reading about the use of dark humor in nursing. And so, okay, I had a hip replacement and 2 weeks later it popped out. Like it just out. Yeah, it was terrifying. It was worse than labor pains. It was awful. So I tried to get Alexa to call 911, but she doesn't have that skill. So she refused. And she was really snotty about it too. You know her vocal tone.
Rude.
So I know she was so rude. And I couldn't call from my phone because I dropped it in the toilet earlier that day. And so it was in a bag of rice over on the kitchen counter. And I'm in my dining room right in front of the front door. And I'm like, how am I supposed to? My kids aren't going to be home for a couple of hours. My husband is dead. I don't know what I'm going to do. And then I remember I had just picked up an Apple Watch from the store. I hadn't set it up yet. So there I am standing on one leg, the other one dangling. I'm crying uncontrollably and setting up my Apple Watch so I could call 911 from my wrist like a spy. So I call 911 and they come and get me and they take me to the emergency room. And I'll admit I was a little looped up on like ketamine and stuff. But the ER nurse, he says, he gets me comfortable. He said, is there anything else I can do for you right now? And I said, yeah. And now forgive me, listeners, because this is going to sound very offensive. But I said, can you tell me the weirdest thing you found in the folds of somebody while giving them a sponge bath? And he goes, I mean, he looked a little surprised.
Yeah,
he goes,
taken aback.
Yeah. And he thought for a second. He said, a fork. I was like, really? Plastic or metal? He said, metal. I was like, oh, okay. So he's like, anything else? I said, no, I'm good. He leaves. And about 20 seconds later, the curtain pulls open and another nurse pops in and said, are you the one that's asking about? And I was like, yeah. And she said, I found a remote control once. And I was like, really? She leaves. As she's leaving, another one pops in and she was like, is this? Yeah. She said, I found half an eaten tuna fish sandwich. And I was like, okay. So pretty soon I have nurses surrounding my bed sharing stories and laughing hysterically until the manager came over and said, you guys, you gotta, you have other patients. But the ortho team stayed and we had some more, banter, and it lifted my spirits. And I think it lifted theirs.
Absolutely.
So what that does, that humor in those cultures, in law enforcement, first responders, nurses, male-dominated occupations, is that it sets the cultural tone. And it's also a test. Are you able to hack it? Like, can you take this, right? If I hide a dismembered hand in your locker and you open your locker and see it, are you going to vomit or laugh? And if you laugh, you're one of us. If you vomit, we're going to keep doing this to you. Right?
So true.
So it's almost a hazing experience.
It is. I was a police chaplain for many years and my dad was a cop. And so that dark humor, many people do not understand.
No, it sounds toxic.
Right.
Unless you're in it.
Yeah. And you experience the cathartic kind of release. Because they're internalizing all of this. And then when they can find some humor that might be offensive to some people, they get that release. Yeah. And that helps them deal with it. Because, cops can't talk. Well, first responders aren't really allowed to
tell
process
stories.
This.
Yeah.
So they laugh, and that's maybe their only outlet.
Right.
And
in my department, we have a law enforcement program that's post-board certified. And so our students, they graduate, they go through 6 months of skills, and then they become police officers. And I've had a number of alums who come back and say, I feel so bad about what I laugh at now.
Mm.
I never thought I would laugh at that, but I can't go home and tell my spouse because they won't get it. I can't tell the story and I can't tell them what I laughed about because it's way beyond what they're capable of holding.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay? And I'm like, yeah, it's necessary because if you can't laugh, you're gonna collapse. I mean, it's the difficulty of the job could be too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. For the job and for life for a lot of people. That's a powerful line. If you're not going to laugh, you're going to collapse. Mm-hmm. I think that's really powerful because when we think about all of these benefits of laughter, if we don't allow ourselves to laugh, which I think is part of being human, we really are at risk. I think of, the body keeps the score.
Oh, yes.
And a very popular book of how the body really sort of records and keeps all of our traumatic incidences. And humor can find a really helpful, constructive way to release some of that.
Yes, absolutely. It's a cognitive shift. Like if you take your hand and put it at the tip of your nose, kind of blocking your vision, and that's what's going on that's the hard time that you're going through, or that's the problem you're dealing with. You're looking forward and it's occluding your vision. You can't see anything except blurry flesh tone, right? You can't see anything but the problem. But if I can laugh, if I can find humor in the situation, it pulls my hand out at arm's length and suddenly I can see the problem, but I can also see context. I can see peripheral vision. I can see all the other pieces that might be, livable and endurable. Yes, the problem still exists, but there's so much more that I can see.
That's exactly how we talked about trauma in on the podcast, is that exact same, almost verbatim.
Yes, I was going to say, I think you've used that.
Yeah, it's such a helpful analogy for people, I think.
Yeah.
Humor. Go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say, you were talking about when you pull your hand away, you can see context and all that stuff. One of the best descriptions of why humor is helpful that I've heard is Dr. David Hawkins said, it's a recontextualization.
Yes.
It recontextualizes the situation so you can see it in a different way. And it's actually, so when we do cognitive behavioral therapy, we're always finding a way to reframe certain beliefs. It's also, I think, a way to reframe a situation.
Yeah.
So I think, it's powerful on all those levels.
Indeed.
Well, we are so thankful. I hate to conclude.
I know.
We're going to have Dr. Mork, a.k.a. Melissa, back.
Do you just want to be on the podcast forever?
I'll just be a third host. No problem.
You have your own podcast.
I do have my own podcast. Isn't that funny, though?
Tell us
what
your podcast.
Forget it.
Okay.
I don't believe you.
It's called Mental Health with Dr. Melissa Mork. I agonized over a creative title for that, and that is what I came up with.
Wow, that's deep.
I know, it's really, but mental health, it's
just kidding.
It's about ditch digging, but
meat cutting.
Meat cutting. You could call it meat cutting.
I get queasy handling chicken cutlets. I don't know how I would have ever gone into meat cutting. It's a very important business skill, occupation, just not for me. But mental health is about mental health. On each episode, I have a guest who talks about their experience with mental illness and their diagnosis, their symptoms, and how did it start, and how did they cope with those symptoms, and what was the diagnosis, what treatments helped, what didn't help, what exacerbated the symptoms, and also, because I'm a person of faith, we talk about how did this experience impact your faith.
Wow.
And what's really interesting is I find that almost every single guest I've had says, you know what, in the midst of my depression or my eating disorder or what have you, I felt so far away from God. I knew he was there, but he existed across a cold, dark, rocky landscape. And it wasn't until I sought treatment that suddenly I felt his presence again. I could feel joy in that relationship. And so that's kind of the arc of each episode. I also have like smaller episodes of just, information around mental health, mental illness, that kind of thing.
So what's the podcast again?
Mental Health with Dr. Melissa Mork.
And you have a book?
I have two books. I have, the first is called Bounce, From Surviving to Thriving Through Loss. And that is a lot about grief and humor. And then the second one is called Mental Health Matters, how 10 psychological principles will enhance your mental health.
Amazing.
It's using different theories that we use in counseling and how it's applied in just enhancing mental health practices and mental health hygiene.
And then your website, and how can people find you kind of online?
Okay, I also agonized over this.
Okay.
It's called melissamork.com.
One more time?
Yeah,
melissamork.com.
Okay.
So thank you, Melissa Mork.
Yes.
And again, that's melissamork.com. And
Not .gov.
no, right.
Or
.me.
Not .edu.
So,
Not
now we confused everybody. What is it?
I know.
Com.
So I'm going to put up a little teaser, challenge you to come back.
Mm-hmm.
I was a pastor for many years, and I would love to talk, is God funny?
Ooh.
Great question.
Yeah, I think we have to have you back sometime to talk about it. I think the whole book of Jonah is like the first Saturday Night Live skit, actually. And so I think we're too serious about God sometimes.
Well, and also we could talk about Job.
We could.
Yeah, the humor in hard times.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be really powerful for people because even people, if they don't have faith, they go to Job or they go to the Psalms, and like a third of the Psalms are lament. And
absolutely.
So
depression exists in the Bible.
Even if people aren't of a certain faith, they still go to those ancient writings and find solace and help and comfort. So maybe we'll have to have you back.
Yeah.
Is God funny?
I like it. I like it a lot.
Teaser for you. Well, again, thank you so much for coming
I've
on.
had so much fun. Thank you for asking me.
Of course, anytime.
Thanks in advance for coming back.
Yeah, exactly. Catch us on.
Well, I'm going to have to listen to these 2 episodes first just to make sure that I'm capable.
And if you have been listening and you find this helpful, please share this with other people. Share it on Facebook or wherever you are with social media platforms. Get the word out. Super helpful, as humor is so essential.
Humor helps.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.